La troisième présentation, ou quatrième, on pourrait dire, nous vient aussi du même coin de l'Europe, Kristof de Witte, qui est, est-ce qu'il est là? Houston. Est-ce qu'il est sur Zoom? Oui, OK, très bien. Bonjour, hello, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Alors, Kristof de Witte est professeur à la faculté d'économie et de commerce de l'Université Leuven en Belgique et titulaire de la chaire Efficacité et efficience des innovations éducatives à l'Université des Nations Unies et plus précisément du Maastricht Economic and Social Research Institute on Innovation and Technology. Est-ce que vous parlez français, Kristof, ou English? English for the
Un petit peu
presentation.
en français, mais je vais parler en anglais si ça.
OK.
Si
Mais je vais vous donner une instruction en français.
Oui, parfait.
Vous avez 20 minutes. Je vais me repointer dans 15 minutes.
Parfait, merci beaucoup.
OK, merci à vous.
Alors, bonjour à tous. My name indeed is Kristof de Witte, so if it's okay, I will speak in English to you. And I read in the chat that many people would like to see the presentation, so that's why you can find my presentation online. If you go to the website of my research group, you can download the presentation there. In the next 20 hours, I would like to, of 20 minutes, sorry, I would like to introduce you a little bit on how to boost the resiliency of school outcomes. Because of course, yeah, this is the largest disruption in schooling in history. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the education system in Flanders, where in 2020, during the pandemic, we had about 9 weeks of school closures, a system that was completely not ready for online learning, for distance learning. So the school system was completely not prepared, such that in the beginning of the pandemic, there was almost no teaching. And that's why in an earlier paper with Joanna Maldonado, we found that there was significant increase in inequality. So the spread in test scores increased massively. And there was reduced learning in about all subjects right after the pandemic. 1 year later, it's a bit contrary or different from the situation in the Netherlands that Carla explained. In Belgium, basically, thanks to the paper of Joanna Maldonado and myself, the Ministry of Education wanted to open the schools at all costs. So basically they said, we won't shut down the schools. They managed to do pretty well, except for 2 weeks of extra holiday. But majority of the time, the schools were open. And so that leaves the question, yeah, what is this doing with the education system? And how can we how can we boost the outcomes that were harmed during the pandemic? A little bit in the same line as the two earlier presentations, so I'm reviewing the literature a little bit, showing that in many countries all over the world, you found similar learning deficits. So in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in UK, a bit later after the pandemic, in the UK and France, etc., you see the same outcomes. Also 1 year after the pandemic, as Carla, the earliest presentation demonstrated, we see in many countries that there is a learning deficit, that there are lower learning attainments nowadays than there were before. And as economists, of course, why would we care about that? Why would we bother about those learning outcomes? Because of course it's it matters. So if you have lower test outcomes, we call as economists, you have lower human capital formation. And if you have lower human capital formation, this might lead to long-term challenges, such as lower income, such as lower earnings, such as increased unemployment, such as more general, less general prosperity. So you see a lot of issues that might arise because of the lower test outcomes. But of course, and that's why we're here, of course, at this conference, all of this holds only to the extent that we can't catch up again, that we can't boost the test scores again. And the question is, why should we? Why can't we change it? And so there are different directions in that perspective. So on the one hand, there is a literature saying that, yeah, knowledge accumulates over time. So if there is a deficit, it also accumulates over time. And there is a theoretical model of Agostestelli et al., showing that if you have, for instance, a learning deficit in the beginning, for instance, you don't know how well to read or to do the math in the beginning, it accumulates over time, such that also learning losses, they might accumulate over time, and also inequality might accumulate over time. A little bit like we see in the summer slide during the summer holidays. Also, earlier evidence shows that, yeah, if there were massive teacher strikes in the past, For instance, in the French-speaking part of Belgium, as well as in Argentina, for instance, they found that it's harmed also students in the long run. And so it means that students, they are not as resilient as we always hope so, or always think so. So in those teacher strikes, I found that there was an impact later on income, on participation in higher education, dropout in higher education, etc. So the schools and the evidence shows that it's not always as resilient. And of course, the third reason why it matters is that there are heterogeneous impacts, not only in socioeconomic status, but also according to the personality traits of students. And together with Kat Iterbeke, I did a research on that in Flanders, showing that the way that students felt and behaved during the school closures, the personality traits, whether persons were open, extrovert, finding out new things, matters in how they experienced the pandemic. And so we typically look at socioeconomic status, but there are also other dimensions to the problem. On the other hand, of course, as also Carla signaled, there is massive policy attention and massive investments. For a report for the European Commission, I summarized what measures and what impact education systems and governments did. And so there is a lot of investments in education, a lot of attention towards education, such that, of course, this might increase also the resiliency of students. Some of the mechanisms where there was a delay in learning attainments also vanished, of course, simply because schools reopened. And nowadays, schools are much better prepared for remote teaching. Typically, in many education systems, you saw an increase in the investments of education in ICT, in teacher professional development, etc. So in this presentation, I'll briefly show you the results of Flanders. So did it accumulate or not? What is about 1 year later? And then I'll find most of my time to the remedial actions. So what can we do and what kind of remedial actions can you take? So if you're interested, this is a full reference to the paper where you can find all details. So first of findings, it's a data set on Flemish education system at the end of primary education. So at the age of 12, we look at standardized test scores and we look at administrative data where we control for all school fixed effects, time trends, because over time the trend is negative in terms of learning outcomes of students. So they learn less and less and less over time due to other issues. And we control for time varying control variables. And the results show, first of all, that if you look 1 year after the pandemic, we could basically confirm our earlier paper, so one that measured the impact immediately after the pandemic, showing that there is a massive decline in test scores in both French foreign language and native language, Dutch, in sciences and math, not for social sciences, but for any other subject. We found a massive decline immediately after the pandemic. 0.24 standard deviations, that's about what the student learns in a half a school year. So it's a massive impact. And if you look then 1 year later in 2021, you see that we added, and that's a bit different from what Carla found, we added additional learning deficits, that's the orange bar, for both French language and Dutch language. So the knowledge deficit accumulated over time for those languages. While we stopped the learning deficits, it didn't disappear, but we stopped the additional learning deficits for sciences and maths. And so this gives a mixed view on the attainment 1 year after the pandemic. With respect to inequality, both this year as well as in the earlier study, we found a strong inequality. So the test scores are more spread out all over the place. So both inequality within schools and between schools increased. In 21, we found that inequality increased in the Dutch language, in languages, but decreased in mathematics. And I'll come to this in a moment to explain that. And then finally, with respect to where are the results larger, we typically look at socioeconomic status, but as I said before, there are also other dimensions like personality traits. But within socioeconomic status, we find that the learning deficits, they increase further if students are have a moderate education background, which is pretty low, so from the most disadvantaged students here. With respect to home language, we didn't find any further additional learning accumulation deficits. And if students are from a good neighborhood and from a bad neighborhood, so these are the poor neighborhoods, then we found even a slight catching up. And I'll come to this in a moment why this happens. So it's in some dimensions, that's the bottom line of the slide, in some dimensions, there is more resiliency of student outcomes than in other dimensions. This is the last graph on the results with respect to the test score distribution, because in the first paper, that's the left-hand side, 1 year or immediately after the pandemic, so that side here, we found that all students, irrespective of their test score distribution, so whether they were smart kids or not so smart kids, so the smart kids are here, the not so smart kids are here, we found a similar impact of the pandemic. So everybody was affected in a similar way. But if you look 1 year after the pandemic, and that's very interesting, we found the differential effects for maths for both students. The strongest students, they saw their test score decreasing, whereas the weakest students, they saw them increasing. So they catched up basically their test scores for the weakest students. And we explained this, if we talk to teachers, we saw that many teachers were shocked by the impact of the pandemic, and they were shocked by what did it do for the most vulnerable students. And so they shifted their attention towards those vulnerable students, and they basically forgot the strongest students, or they thought those strong students, they will make up for themselves, there won't be any issue, and the weakest students, they gave all of the attention. And that's what you see in the graph here. So definitely for maths, you see that the stronger students, we lose them basically, so they have less educational attainments 1 year after the pandemic than before, whereas the weakest students, yeah, they are basically catching up a bit. And so that's definitely because of all of the attention that was given to this group of students. In the last part of this presentation, in the next 5 minutes, I would like to show you a little bit on what we can do, because in Flanders, we try to invest, as in many other countries, we try to build back basically. And so this is the building back. What can we do to catch up again and to boost the resiliency of the student outcomes? And one thing that we did is creating summer schools. The summer schools, they targeted specifically the most vulnerable students, the students with the weakest background in terms of socioeconomic status, the students with the lowest test scores. And you see in this graph that it worked, those summer schools. The summer schools, they focus, for instance, if the summer schools, these are the effects both for languages as well as for math. And I differentiate here the test scores in areas with the summer schools and in areas without a summer school. And you see that in areas with a summer school, that's the additional learning deficit stopped. They didn't accumulate over time for languages. They even improved for math for the weakest students, whereas in areas without a summer school, there was a further accumulation of the learning deficits. So the knowledge was not there, and it further accumulated the absence of knowledge for languages. Whereas for math, you see the same pattern. So they increased in areas with a summer school and it decreased in areas without a summer school. So that's again a signal that we can do something about it, and we can definitely help the most vulnerable students in that perspective. Other ways that we summarized here in this graph are, for instance, increased instruction time. It's a bit similar to the earlier presentation, but here we also added the costs and the effectiveness, but definitely the cost side. And instruction time, for instance, it's costly, but one thing you can also do is focus on the fundamental competences. Not every element within the curriculum is as important as the other elements. So if you focus on what matters for those students and you give the students specifically those competences to make sure that if they go on to a different year and a different study year, that the knowledge that the learning deficit doesn't accumulate over time, that at least this knowledge is there, then it might be a very effective strategy. So that's one way. Additional instruction time is another way, a little bit like the summer programs. Another thing that was mentioned in the presentation before was tutoring. So in Flanders, we also invested quite a bit of money and effort in tutoring, such that we can help the most vulnerable students, the students that were left behind basically, in intensive tutoring programs. And they fulfilled all of the criteria that were outlined a moment ago, such that I hope that might be effective, and that's what we hope to see in the data later on. Also involving parents, that's one tour that we try to take. So trying to boost parental involvement in education and trying to show what parents can do, and trying to avoid great repetition, because of course we know that great repetition is quite harmful for students. For the average student, it doesn't help, and as such, the pandemic, of course, there are other ways, other techniques to build back the education system. And finally, one thing that I definitely want to do in Flanders, where I'm trying to speak with the minister and with all kind of policy institutions, is instead of just building back, also trying to build better. And here I just plotted the test scores of PISA of Canada. And you see that already since the starting of PISA, so at the age of 15 years old, measured by the OECD, at the age of 15 years old in 2000, PISA test scores for reading were about 535. PISA test scores for Canada by 2018, the latest PISA wave, were about 520. So this means that over time, also the Canadian system is decreasing in performances. And we look all the time to COVID-19 impacts. But also over time, in those 20 years' time, we lost also in Canada up to half of a school year of learning attainments since the start of the PISA tests. And that's why I try to argue all the time that we should try to think about building back, and building back is on the focus on the COVID-19 pandemic, but also building better. Try to create a stop in this quality of the stop of the decreasing quality of the education system, and do it in a better way. And the COVID-19 pandemic provides an excellent momentum to do this. So try to create what we call in Germany a PISA shock. Try to make sure that we do better and focus on things like professional development of teachers. More ICT hardware and software, which are needed for future resistance against pandemics, but are also needed to change the PISA test scores. Focus on the curriculum design, which is needed, as I said, for COVID-19 pandemic, but is also interesting to change the trend in the PISA test scores. School management, parental involvement, accountability. So many elements that can change the decline in the test scores for PISA and other tests can also be used for the COVID-19 pandemic and vice versa. So that's in a nutshell my presentation. I hope that I convinced you that the learning effects and the learning deficits are real due to the pandemic, but there is hope. Some of those elements, they definitely work. That's what we see in our Flemish data. And at the same time, use the momentum of the pandemic, use the attention that policymakers have in the pandemic to also change the system in a better way, and to use this as a build back and build better strategy. Thank you very much.